Hello, everyone. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with where you from and what time it is. That way, YouTube will keep pulling you stories like this. Now, let the shadows take over. Story 1, The Cold Need Uppsala Window. Uppsala, Sweden, in the late autumn, is a place built for silence. The cold is a constant, mineral presence, and the old university town feels heavy with centuries of history. The house we were in, my friend Ellen's grandmother's place, was a narrow, gabled structure built of dark wood, set back from the main road near a thick stand of pines. It was a perfect contained world for a high school sleepover. It was exactly the kind of night where sound mattered. The temperature had plummeted, and a cold, insistent rain had started, driven by a wind that moaned low over the roof tiles. The wind and rain worked together, creating a constant, hypnotic, shuddering sound that rattled the ancient single-pane windows. We were curled up in Ellen's room, located on the second floor, directly overlooking the dark, water-slicked garden. The atmosphere inside was warm, smelling of old wool and coffee, but the world outside was a study in cold chaos. The unblinking gaze. The moment the terror began was marked by a sudden, jarring change in the auditory design. The relentless, chaotic sound of the rain was cut. It didn't stop, but the sound of it hitting the window directly in front of us, a wide, rectangular pane, ceased entirely. It was replaced by a dull, muffled thudding, as if a heavy, wet blanket had been suddenly pressed against the glass. We froze, staring at the window. The interior light cast a soft, diffused glow. And then she appeared, standing directly outside the glass, closer than the rain, closer than the wind, was a woman. She was tall, shrouded in a dark, formless cloth that clung to her, looking saturated with water. Her hair was matted and dark, plastered to her skull and cheeks, streaming water that didn't seem to be affected by gravity. Her face was impossible to read in the low light. It was unnaturally pale, almost luminous, and fixed on us with an unblinking, desolate intensity. The terror was not that she was hostile, but that she was absolutely, profoundly present, standing in a place where only the storm should be. The pressure and the cold. The woman didn't move her body, but her hand began to rise, slowly and deliberately. It was a small, delicate hand, but it looked translucent, the skin pale and waterlogged. It came to rest on the window pane, right in the center of our view. She pressed her palm flat against the glass. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Where the hand touched the glass, the pane did not just fog, it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. A spiderweb of thick, sudden frost shot out from the point of contact, spreading instantly across the interior side of the glass. We could feel the drop in temperature, a rush of cold air that smelled like the bottom of a deep lake. The woman was trying to make contact, not to break in, but to press her desperate need through the barrier. Her gaze was not menacing. It was a cold, suffocating plea for recognition. We were trapped by the sight, too terrified to scream, our own shallow breaths fogging the air around us, which instantly hit that icy patch and condensed into fine droplets. After what felt like an hour, the hand slowly retreated from the glass. The dark figure lingered for another minute, its face turned toward us in that silent, unyielding stare. Then, just as the window was beginning to warm slightly and the frost recede, the figure simply stepped backward, dissolving into the chaos of the wind and the falling rain, becoming indistinguishable from the gray night. The cold revelation. We fled the room and woke Ellen's grandmother, a formidable woman with deep, quiet eyes. We poured out the story, terrified she would dismiss us as hysterical. Grandmother listened to every word, her face growing rigid and pale. She didn't question the frost or the muffled rain. She led us to an old leather-bound photo album in the living room. She opened it to a brittle, yellowed picture from the 1940s, two girls sitting on a dock. One was Ellen's grandmother. The other, the girl in the picture, was identical to the face we had just seen. Same luminous, pale features, same dark hair. "That was my sister, Ingrid," grandmother said, her voice dry and distant. "She drowned in Lake Mellerin when she was 15, out on the ice. They never recovered her until the spring thaw." She closed the album, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "Ingrid was terrified of being by herself," grandmother whispered, the sound thin and brittle. "She couldn't stand it, and I think the lake only made it worse. When the house gets too quiet and the cold comes in, she comes back to the window, hoping someone will let her in." The terror shifted instantly from fear of attack to horror of identification. The woman wasn't an evil spirit. She was a desperate, eternal presence, unable to accept the profound solitude of her death. We had seen absolute crushing loneliness made manifest. The encounter with Ingrid taught us a chilling truth. The fear that clings the longest isn't the threat of harm, but the dread of emotional reality. We survived the night, but the quiet knowledge that some souls are so terrified of being alone that they will forever press their cold, wet hands against the glass, seeking just one witness, never leaves you. It transforms the simple silence of your own home into a perpetual state of empathetic dread. Story 2: The Unsealed Silence. Dorset Cottage. The cottage was ancient, a squat, dark stone structure buried deep in the Dorset countryside. It smelled permanently of cold earth, mildew, and the smoke from 1,000 past fires. We, my friend Sasha and I, had rented it for a week of cheap freedom, ignoring the local whispers that the place was too quiet. The cottage was built low to the ground, with thick, uneven floorboards that creaked under every step. The most unnerving feature was in the small, dusty pantry, a large, square section of the floor that felt cold and loose. Beneath it, secured by a heavy iron latch and 3 layers of thick, lead-painted wood, was the cellar. We were bored, curious, and arrogant. We were teenagers, and sealed silences were simply invitations. The warning below: it took us an hour with a rusty screwdriver and a crowbar, but we managed to break the seal. The heavy panel groaned open, releasing a cloud of cold, stagnant air that smelled intensely of wet chalk and buried bone. We shone our phone lights down. The cellar was shallow, perhaps 4 feet deep, with a dirt floor and low stone walls. It was utterly empty, save for a few piles of rubble and the deep, silent blackness. We decided it was boring and quickly sealed it again, congratulating ourselves on our bravery. We went to bed, the oppressive quiet of the house now feeling slightly looser, slightly more charged. The silence broke at 3:08. I was startled awake by a sound that came from directly beneath my pillow. It wasn't a creak or a sigh. It was a rhythmic, sharp knocking. Knock, knock, pause, knock. The sound was not loud, but its proximity and unnerving clarity made it devastating. It was focused, intelligent, and it was coming from the thin space between the floorboards and the cold cellar dirt, the space we had disturbed just hours before. Sasha sat up instantly, her breath catching in her throat. We stared wide-eyed at the floor. Knock, knock, knock. The rhythm changed, becoming frantic, demanding. Then, the auditory terror shifted. The knocking stopped, and a new sound began. It was a whisper, thin, high, and profoundly cold. It seemed to travel through the wood, vibrating the floorboards like the skin of a drum. The voice was female, raw with desperation, and it said 3 words, "Let me out." The buried name. We were out of the cottage by sunrise, throwing our bags into the car and driving until the dark stone walls of Dorset were distant memory. We convinced ourselves it was the heating, the wind, or shared mass hysteria. But the ghost had already secured passage. We had stopped at a roadside cafe, trying to regain some normalcy. I was scrolling through my phone, deleting old emails, when a notification popped up, a new voicemail. The timestamp was 3:05 a.m., minutes after we heard the whisper. My hands trembling, I hit play. The recording was mostly static and the sound of my own bedroom floorboards creaking as I sat up, but cutting through the noise, clear and chilling, was the whisper. It was the same voice, strained and desperate, but this time the words were slightly different. Eleanor Calloway. It was a name, not a threat, but a demand for recognition, delivered through the impersonal medium of my voicemail. It was proof that the entity we had unleashed was not bound by the stone and dirt of the cottage. It was using the wires and signals of the modern world to follow us. We pulled into the nearest library, researching the area of the cottage. The name Eleanor Calloway was a deep cut, a record of a local woman who had vanished in 1898. The only detail recorded was that her husband, a reclusive miner, claimed she had run off, but locals suspected he had sealed her into a forgotten hiding spot on their property. The date of her disappearance correlated with the construction date of the cellar. The horror was complete. We hadn't been haunted by a random spirit. We had unsealed a century-old tragedy and given her name back to the world. The lifelong silence. We never returned to Dorset. We changed our numbers and moved to separate cities, but the silence we had broken remained shattered. The final terror is this: the ghost of Eleanor Calloway does not need the cold, dark cellar anymore. It has access to the ubiquitous silence of the internet, the static on a phone line, the echo in an empty voicemail box. Sometimes, when I am alone and my phone is silent, I still feel the cold dread of that single sharp knock coming from beneath my floor, no matter what floor of what building I am in. The chilling lesson of the cottage is absolute curiosity unleashes buried ghosts. Some silences must stay sealed. We learn that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, and some doors should never be opened, for the things trapped inside aren't looking for freedom. They're looking for a new place to haunt. Story 3. This is the final cinematic realism rewrite for The Attic Door, Zurich Alps, Switzerland, focusing on the deep isolation, the psychological horror of mimicry, and the haunting symbolism of the locked door. The Echo Gauge. The Attic Door. The lodge was perched high in the Zurich Alps, a massive, dark timber structure built to defy centuries of snow and silence. My friend Felix and I, 17, feeling indestructible, were spending a week there alone. The air was thin, cold, and tasted metallic, and the only sound outside was the deep, constant whoosh of the wind moving over the peaks. Inside, the lodge was all shadows and ancient wood. Every footstep echoed, and the silence that filled the gaps was so profound it felt like a pressure against the ears. Our fixation settled immediately on the attic door. It was located on the top floor, landing heavy, scarred oak, secured by a lock that looked medieval. The mechanism was large and brass, guarded by a key that hung from a thick iron loop on a nail nearby. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed. The jambs were slightly warped, and a thin, continuous layer of dust covered the threshold, untouched, for what looked like decades. "Grandfather said we aren't to touch it," Felix warned, his voice too loud in the stillness. "Said there's nothing up there but old air and bad luck." Naturally, we touched it. The listener, we took the brass key. It was heavy and cold, smelling faintly of age and oil. The key turned with a loud, groaning grind, but the door refused to move. The sheer weight of the timber and the pressure of time held it fast. We locked it again, but the damage was done. The seal was broken. That night, the house felt different. The familiar creaking of the beams was replaced by a more subtle, unnerving sound from directly above our room, the slow, soft scuff of something shifting weight on the wooden planks of the attic floor. The true horror began when we spoke. Felix was recounting a stupid story about a teacher, his voice low and animated. Midway through a sentence, the sound from above changed. It was a perfect, chilling mimicry. It was a repetition, a high, thin echo of Felix's own voice, repeating the last few words he had spoken. "Never listen, never listen." The sound wasn't distorted, and it wasn't exactly human. It was perfectly accurate, but rendered in a way that sounded hollow, as if the sound waves themselves had been drained of all warmth and substance. It sounded like an accurate playback from inside a sealed glass jar. We stopped talking. We stared at the ceiling. Minutes later, the attic played again. This time, it was a sound we had made earlier. During a quick argument, a high-pitched, frustrated sigh, followed by a soft, sharp whine of frustration. Our own private, intimate sounds, recorded and delivered back to us by the darkness above. Whatever was behind that attic door wasn't trying to scare us. It was listening, cataloging, and practicing. It was gathering the data of our voices, compiling a perfect replica of our own consciousness. We spent the rest of the night huddled awake, refusing to utter a single word, terrified that any sound we made would simply be added to the creature's auditory arsenal. The final key turn. We left the lodge the next morning, leaving the heavy brass key hanging back on its nail. We never spoke of the attic again, pushing the memory into the category of shared teenage delusion. But the silence was never the same for Felix. He became quiet, reserved, constantly listening to the air around him. 10 years later, we decided to return. It was a pilgrimage, an attempt to prove that the attic was just an old room, and the sound was just a trick of the wind. The lodge was exactly as we had left it, stone, wood, and the deep, cold silence. The attic door was still closed, the thick layer of dust still covering the threshold. But the brass key was gone. We searched for 2 days. Felix grew increasingly agitated, obsessively checking the floorboards and the door jambs. He needed to prove it was locked. He needed to prove the silence was real. On the 3rd morning, I woke up alone. Felix was gone. His bed was empty, the covers thrown back. The cottage was silent, the mountain outside bathed in the sharp, blinding glare of morning snow. I checked every room, every closet, and finally, I went to the attic door. It was still closed, but jammed tightly into the gap between the door and the stone sill was a single, unmistakable object, the heavy, cold brass key. I immediately called the local authorities. They searched the lodge and the surrounding area. No tracks in the snow leading away. No signs of a struggle. Felix had simply vanished. The police concluded he must have walked out, lost, or perhaps taken his own life. I knew the truth was far colder. I knew the price of breaking the silence. I walked back up to the attic door. I reached down, pulled the key from the sill, and unlocked the heavy brass mechanism. The key turned with that same agonizing grind it had 10 years ago. I pushed the door open, releasing a cloud of freezing, sterile air. The space was utterly empty, bare beams, dust, and shadow. I stood there, staring into the dark. I didn't see Felix, but then, from the deepest corner of the empty attic, a sound began. It was a slow, quiet, muffled laughter. It was two voices, perfectly synchronized, perfectly hollow, repeating a simple phrase that Felix and I had whispered when we first locked the door 10 years earlier. Never let it out. Never let it out. I didn't close the door. I simply walked away, leaving the attic open, carrying only the brass key, the object that represented the boundary we should have respected. The theme of the Zurich attic is clear curiosity, mimicry, and doors best left closed. Some silences are not meant to be broken, and the scariest thing in the world is finding out that the hidden entity knows you better than you know yourself. The key is now my only companion, a cold, heavy reminder of the voice that was cloned and the friend who became its final echo. Story 4, The Static Echo, the House That Listened. The city of Ghent, Belgium, is beautiful, but its ancient center feels like a series of tight, cold secrets. Our rental house, a tall, cramped 3-story structure near the canal, was one of them. It was beautiful, all exposed beams and steep staircases, but it was also profoundly silent, the thick plaster walls absorbing all sound. My roommate, Evelyn, and I, Saskia, were typical college students, relying on streaming media and constant phone contact. But the house rejected technology. Our Wi-Fi was perpetually weak, and all our devices suffered from strange, intermittent static interference. We started noticing tiny details, the peculiar way the closet door in the main hallway never quite stayed shut, and the constant feeling that the silence was not empty, but filled with suppressed attention. The web of wires. The mundane discovery was the most terrifying part. Evelyn was setting up a bookshelf in the living room, wrestling with a long, old extension cord, when she noticed a section of the plaster near the baseboard looked slightly loose. She chipped at it with a butter knife. Behind the cracked plaster, the stone wall was riddled with thin copper wire, not electrical wiring, but dense, spider web-like strands, the kind of fine wire used for discrete audio transmission. With growing, cold dread, we followed the trail. The wires ran beneath the floorboards, up the door jambs, and behind the heating vents. The entire structure of the house, we realized, was hardwired for listening. Every room, every corner, was laced with discrete, tiny microphones, old, passive surveillance equipment built into the very architecture of the house. It was a total, absolute violation of space, a network of hidden ears built by some paranoid previous owner. We found the central node hidden behind the fuse box, an antique, dust-caked receiver console. It was powered off, cold, and dead. But the sheer scale of the intrusion, the fact that we had lived here for months, talking, laughing, and whispering secrets into a physical network of eavesdropping devices made our skin crawl. The voice in the static, we decided to dismantle the system, starting with the receiver. As Evelyn reached out to disconnect the main bundle of wires, the device gave a single, loud, agonizing spark. The room was plunged into silence, but the receiver was now live. A low, violent, static hiss filled the air, thick and heavy, like air being pulled through raw silk. The small, antique speaker on the console flared to life, its grill vibrating with raw electrical noise. And then, cutting through the white noise, came a voice. It was male, deep, and unnervingly close, as if the speaker was pressed directly to our ears. It was a cold, possessive whisper, laced with an intense, proprietary anger. "You're not supposed to be here." The air in the room went instantly cold. The voice didn't sound like a radio transmission. It sounded like a soul trapped inside the static, furious at being heard. It wasn't just a physical intruder. It was the house itself speaking. The voice paused, then repeated the sentence, the static swelling and collapsing around the words. A suffocating, electrical embrace. "You're not supposed to be here." We abandoned the house within the hour, leaving the receiver hissing and crackling in the cold silence of the living room. We had entered a space that had never been truly vacant. It had simply been listening. The unavoidable presence. We moved across town, but the surveillance followed us. We had escaped the stone and plaster, but not the entity that used the wires. The haunting became digital. It began subtly. My phone, left sitting silent on the nightstand, would suddenly flare up with a blast of violent static. When I answered, there would be nothing, just the raw shh of pure interference. But beneath it, a faint, rhythmic whisper that I could never quite decipher. Evelyn started having the dreams. She would wake up sweating, describing the same vision. She was standing in the Ghent house, but the walls were translucent, revealing the maze of copper wires running through the entire structure. And she would hear the voice, not through her ears, but inside her mind, whispering her name, followed by that cold declaration, "You're not supposed to be here." The presence had found its true medium. It had moved from the physical architecture of the house to the invisible infrastructure of modern life. It was a digital ghost, traveling through phone signals, Wi-Fi networks, and the private space of our subconscious. Years passed. The Ghent house was sold and gutted, the wires presumably ripped out of the walls. But sometimes, when I'm alone in an empty room, I still feel a spike of cold air. I still pick up my phone and check the screen, convinced it's about to erupt in static. The fear is no longer about a ghost in an attic. It's about the deep, chilling knowledge that every communication device is a potential microphone, and every moment of silence is a potential eavesdrop. The theme of the Ghent house is a new, devastating kind of horror paranoia, surveillance, and technology is haunting. We learn that true privacy is dead, and the modern world has simply provided a more effective network for the spirits that thrive on knowing your secrets. That cold, possessive whisper that said, "You're not supposed to be here," follows us still, a permanent echo gauge of our lack of solitude. Story 5. The Eternal Lullaby. Veliki Novgorod Dacha, the wooden cottage, or dacha, sat on the cold edge of Veliki Novgorod, buried beneath an aggressive, unforgiving Russian winter. The snow was piled halfway up the windows, turning the old single-pane glass into screens of frosted white. My friend, Dmitri, and I, Ivan, had traveled there for the sheer isolation, but by Saturday night, the isolation had become terrifying. The house was built of massive, dark timber, smelling deeply of pine resin and years of trapped stove smoke. We were completely snowbound, the world outside reduced to the frantic howl of the blizzard and the constant, dry creak of the ancient wood struggling against the cold. The old woman who rented the dacha to us had smiled a tired, knowing smile. "Don't mind Babushka's music," she said. "She likes to sing when it's cold." We thought it was a charming, rustic touch. We quickly learned it was not. The sound in the walls. The singing began shortly after the stove fire died down. It started not as a voice, but as a subtle, low-frequency vibration that resonated in the air, vibrating the fine crystal glasses on the mantelpiece. It was a profound, humming sound, felt more in the chest than heard with the ears. Then, the sound organized itself. It became a distinct, high-pitched, mournful lullaby. It was simple, cyclical, and achingly beautiful, but its source was impossible to place. It didn't come from a radio, and it didn't come from outside. It seemed to come from inside the walls themselves, circulating through the dense timber beams and the plaster. 1 minute, the melody was concentrated in the wall behind the kitchen stove. The next, it was humming faintly in the corner of the ceiling directly above our heads. It felt like a warm, desperate presence trapped in the very structure of the house, trying to soothe a child who was not there. The horror was in the sound's persistence and its context. A mother's song, sung forever, without a mother or a child. It was a perfect, chilling grief loop. We spent hours huddled together, whispering about ghosts, intruders, or simple electrical interference, but the lullaby was too personal, too tender, to be mechanical. It was the sound of a memory playing out, ceaselessly, in the deepest silence of the Russian countryside. The true melody. By dawn, the song was gone, replaced by the profound, exhausted quiet of the house. We were too shaken to leave, the snow too deep to drive through. We had to find the source. We followed the trail of the loudest residual humming, which seemed to be centered in the small, rarely used dining room. In the corner stood a massive, dark, heavy wooden chest, an artifact that looked older than the house itself. We struggled to open the lid. Inside, it was filled with old linens, dried lavender, and, finally, a bundle of yellowed photographs tied with a satin ribbon. As we looked through the pictures, Dmitri stopped breathing. One photo was a portrait of a woman with kind, weary eyes, the old woman who had rented us the dacha. Another showed that same woman, younger, holding a tiny baby swaddled in white wool. On the back, written in the graceful Cyrillic script of the era, was the date, followed by a single word, Tikhon. And then, Dmitri found the final, devastating piece of context, a third, much smaller, hand-colored photograph showing the grandmother, Elena, sitting in a rocking chair, her lips slightly parted in a faint smile as if she was singing. The dacha wasn't haunted by malice. It was haunted by an eternal mother's love. The song was for Tikhon, a child who had passed too soon. And the lullaby was the only thing that remained a perpetual comfort loop played by a spirit unable to stop caring for its lost child. The unending comfort. We stayed in the cottage for the rest of the week. The blizzard continued. The isolation remained, but the terror was gone. When the snow piled deep outside and the cold intensified, the walls of the dacha would once again begin to hum. We didn't run. We would sit quietly by the fire, listening to the high, fragile melody of the singing grandmother. We reinterpreted the sound. It was no longer a threat trying to lure us out or drive us mad. It was an act of profound, unwavering memory, a love transcending the finality of death. We were simply present for a moment of eternal, familial comfort. The lesson of the Veliky Novgorod dacha is one of quiet, humbling realization. Not all fear is malevolent. Some of it is simply profound love misplaced by loss. The singing grandmother taught us that a house can be filled with a spirit song of remembrance and love, and our willingness to listen with empathy can silence the fear that our ignorance amplified. Story 6, The Human Monster, The Knock in Naples. The apartment was not grand, a cramped, humid third-floor unit in an ancient, crowded palazzo in Naples, Italy. The air in the city is thick, loud, and constantly alive, but inside the apartment, the thick stone walls provided a rare, oppressive silence. I was visiting my friend Mateo. We were both 18, talking about the future and feeling the heavy, cold pressure of exams. His father, usually a cheerful, loud presence, had been acting strangely for weeks, distracted, nervous, taking hushed calls on a burner phone. It was late, maybe midnight. We were in the small, curtained living room. The only light came from the blue screen of the TV and the distant, chaotic cacophony of the Neapolitan night filtering through the closed windows. The horror started not with a shadow or a whisper, but with a sound that signaled a total breach of safety. The aggressive rhythm. It was a knock on the front door. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't friendly. It was a heavy, hard bam, 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 a demanding, aggressive rhythm that made the whole metal and wood frame of the door vibrate in its jam. Mateo and I froze instantly. The knocking stopped, and then came again, louder, colder, and more insistent. Bam, 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 bam. Mateo's face went white. He mouthed one word to me, Papa. His father wasn't home. He was working late, a frequent, new excuse that now sounded flimsy and terrifying. We crouched low behind the heavy, outdated sofa, using the thick, musty cushions as our absurd barrier. The silence that followed the knock was not empty. It was filled with the sound of heavy, deliberate breathing from the hallway outside. Then, a voicemail, sharp and laced with a cold, predatory confidence spoke through the locked door. The voice was in Neapolitan dialect, heavy and fast, but the meaning was brutally clear. We know you're in there. Tell your father the interest has compounded. Time is over. We need to discuss the new terms, face to face. The chill was immediate and absolute. This wasn't a joke, a ghost, or a supernatural entity. This was the raw, immediate terror of human evil. The betrayal. The men outside didn't leave. We heard them shuffling, their low, impatient voices muttering about Mateo's father's weakness. We heard the chilling metallic clink of something hard being adjusted, the sound of an object that existed only to inflict pain. We stayed rigid behind the sofa for 45 agonizing minutes. The knocking resumed periodically sharp, shocking explosions that tried to shatter our nerves. Finally, we heard the men descend the stairs, their footsteps slow, heavy, and deliberately unhurried, signaling their confidence and their intention to return. The horror wasn't over. It had just retreated to the shadows. When Mateo's father returned hours later, smelling of smoke and desperation, the air in the room was thick with unspoken tragedy. Mateo confronted him, detailing the men, the knocks, and the demand for a compounded debt. The man's facade crumbled. He confessed to a massive, hidden debt to local figures, a deal he had kept secret, believing he could fix it before the two worlds collided. His love for his family had been eclipsed by a desperate, private betrayal of safety. We had faced the supernatural in our minds countless times, but nothing compared to the shock of realizing the true monster was human, and the danger had been invited in by the one person meant to guarantee our safety. The fragility wasn't in the walls, it was in the foundation of trust. The lifelong watch. The experience scarred us permanently. Mateo's family had to flee Naples in the night, abandoning everything, simply to survive the consequence of that hidden debt. We never saw a ghost after that night. We never heard a spectral whisper, but we gained a vigilance far colder and more consuming than any ghost story could provide. We learned to watch faces, to listen for the absence of truth in a loved one's voice, and to recognize the terrifying sound of an unsettled score. The lesson of the knock in Naples is the raw, sharp wisdom of the street. Human evil and fragile safety are the only true horrors. The greatest terror is not a hidden monster in the attic, but the secret carried by the person you trust. That terrifying knock, signaling danger and betrayal, remains the emotional gauge for every relationship we enter. We survived the night, but we now carry a lifelong awareness that fear lives within secrets, and respect for the darkness is the only way to avoid opening the door to the predators who thrive in human weakness. Story 7. The Cold Gauge Lights on Lake Champlain. The cabin was a low, single-story structure built of rough cedar, hugging the frozen shore of Lake Champlain, Vermont. It was deep winter, and the vast lake had become a flat, seamless expanse of brittle, dark ice and heavy snow. My friend Sarah and I, Lena, were seeking the solitude of the cold, but what we found was an absolute penetrating silence that felt like a trap. The temperature was impossibly low. The only sound outside was the deep, resonant groan and crack of the ice as the cold pressure shifted the lake floor, a low, terrifying noise that made the cabin's foundation shudder. The Blue Beacon. We were sitting by the wood stove late on the first night, bundled in thick blankets, watching the world through the wide picture window. The night was absolute black, relieved only by the distant, pale light of the stars. Then, the world changed. Far out on the frozen surface of the lake, about half a mile from shore, a light appeared. It wasn't a flare, or a boat impossible on the ice, or a car. It was a faint, impossibly electric blue, a steady, glowing orb that hovered just inches above the ice. As we watched, paralyzed by the beauty and the impossibility, a second light flared to life nearby, and then a third. Within minutes, there was a cluster of 6 blue beacons arranged in a rough, uneven circle, pulsing with a cold, desperate luminescence over the absolute black of the frozen water. They didn't move. They simply sat there, radiating a high, icy blue glow that illuminated the surrounding white snow. It felt like watching an emergency beacon from an impossible, unreachable depth. We watched for nearly an hour until the light began to fade, slowly, individually, sinking back into the darkness until the lake was silent and black once more. The trace of water, the experience left us shaken but alive with shared mystery. We spent the next morning trying to rationalize it: swamp gas, atmospheric phenomena, anything but the impossible. But the mystery had followed us inside. We were walking through the cabin, checking the wood stove, when Sarah stopped, pointing a trembling finger at the floor. The cabin was rustic, with unpolished pine floorboards, and pressed into the fine layer of dust on the floor, leading from the back door and stopping dead center in the living room, was a line of footprints. They were small, distinct, and terrifyingly barefoot. The prints were clear and unmistakable, but the violation wasn't just the lack of shoes, it was the condition of the floorboards immediately around them. Each print was surrounded by a thin, dark ring of melting snow and cold water. Whatever made these tracks had walked from the shore, across the frozen snow, and into our warm cabin without ever wiping off the ice water clinging to its skin. And like the lights on the lake, the prints didn't lead back. They stopped abruptly in the center of the living room rug and vanished. The being that walked the frozen lake had been inside our warm space, leaving behind chilling proof of its presence before dissolving into the air. The eternal message. We fled the cabin immediately, never solving the physics of the barefoot prints or the nature of the lights. But the presence followed us, not through knocks or whispers, but through the digital residue of our lives. Years later, Both Sarah and I began to experience the same recurring message. It wasn't a text. It was a feeling that manifested in our media, a silent notification on a blank phone screen, or a flash of static during a quiet moment of a video. It was a persistent, visual noise that demanded attention. And in our dreams, we saw the lights again, always the same 6 blue beacons, hovering over the ice, now accompanied by the faint, muffled sound of running water and the distant cry of a child. Through research into local Lake Champlain history, the terror finally yielded to tragedy. We found records detailing a catastrophic sleigh accident decades prior, a family crossing the frozen lake that plummeted through a sudden fissure in the ice. The records mentioned 6 people lost, never recovered until the spring thaw. The 6 lights. The barefoot prints weren't made by a predator. They were made by a frozen soul desperate for warmth. The lights weren't a warning. They were beacons of remembrance, a plea from the spirits trapped beneath the ice, terrified of being forgotten in the vast, cold silence. The fear was finally reinterpreted. The terror wasn't that they wanted to hurt us, but that they wanted us to remember them. The lesson of the lake is clear. Vigilance and respect for the unknown are necessary, but sometimes the deepest fear stems from simple human tragedy. The lights on the lake taught us that the true horror is indifference, and the ghosts who haunt the cold spaces are simply waiting for someone to acknowledge the depth of their suffering and the beautiful, fragile fact that they once lived. Story 8. This is the final cinematic realism rewrite for The Intruder in the Alps, Austria, which transforms a night of human terror into a powerful realization about courage and connection. The shared core. The Intruder in the Alps. The chalet was wood, glass, and heavy stone, a fortress against the sheer, overwhelming cold of the Austrian Alps. My friend Lucas and I, Clara, had rented it for a weekend retreat from university, seeking the quiet that only the mountains can provide. By Saturday night, we were snowbound, trapped by a fresh dump of powder that sealed the access road. The chalet felt cozy, but the windows looked out onto a world of pure, indifferent white. The air inside smelled of pine resin and the clean, mineral scent of melting snow. The only sound was the deep sigh of the wind outside and the gentle, regular tick of the wood stove cooling down. We felt untouchable, buffered by stone and distance. The displaced object, the realization that our safety was an illusion, came subtly, violently. We had just returned to the main living room after checking the stove in the basement. As we climbed the stairs, Lucas stopped short, his body going instantly rigid. He wasn't looking at the door or the window. He was staring at the fireplace mantel. An old, heavy bronze Swiss Army knife, Lucas's grandfather's, which he had left lying on the coffee table just an hour before, was now resting precisely on the mantelpiece, perfectly centered. It was impossible. Neither of us had been in the room. We scanned the space, our eyes moving quickly from the knife to the windows, noticing the details only fear can sharpen. The large front window, which had been securely latched, was now ajar by less than a centimeter, enough to let in a thread of freezing air that carried the faintest smell of wet wool and pine needles. The snow outside was too deep and pristine to show tracks, but someone or something had entered, moved the knife with deliberate purpose, and silently left. The terror was profound because it was human. There was no mystery, no ghost, just a quiet, purposeful violation by a mind as real as our own. The night of core truths. We locked every internal door, barricading ourselves into the small second-floor bedroom, wedging a chair beneath the handle. We turned off our phones, not wanting the blue light to signal our presence. The room was plunged into absolute blackness. The night became a study in shared, confined fear. We lay on the floor, huddled beneath a massive eider-down duvet, refusing to move or speak, convinced the intruder was still somewhere in the silent, echoing structure of the chalet, listening to the lack of sound. The fear was a physical presence, but it also became a powerful catalyst. The moment of shared terror stripped away all our pretense, all the casual distance of academic friendship. We were reduced to two biological entities surviving a primal threat. Lucas was pressed against me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. In that absolute terrifying darkness, separated only by thin fabric, we were forced into a profound intimacy. I could feel the tension in his muscles, the cold fear radiating from his skin, and in that terrifying total vulnerability, a deep, silent trust was forged. We were no longer two friends. We were a single, surviving unit. We realized that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't the intruder in the house. It was being alone. The sound of my own quiet, ragged breath was terrifying, but the sound of Lucas's steady breathing next to me became an anchor, the only proof that reality still held. Wisdom and connection, the sun finally rose, a blinding, indifferent glare over the Alps. We waited an hour past sunrise before checking the house. It was empty. The window was still ajar, and the Swiss Army knife still sat perfectly centered on the mantelpiece, a silent, mocking reminder. We left the chalet that day, driving carefully through the fresh snow, never solving the identity of the intruder or their motive. But we had been profoundly changed. The experience did not leave us broken. It left us aware. The paralyzing fear we felt didn't turn into trauma. It transformed into wisdom. We learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to breathe, think, and act when the air around you is turning to ice. Our friendship, forged in that intense, confined darkness, became unbreakable. The intruder, ironically, had been our greatest teacher. He had taught us that life is fragile, but the greatest courage is the ability to maintain presence, and the deepest survival mechanism is connection. That night in the Alps became our shared core, our silent, enduring gauge for the precious, vital safety found only in the warmth of another human presence. You can try to sleep now, but your mind won't let you. Because somewhere between the edge of dream and the sound of your own breathing, you'll remember one of these stories. The flicker of the flashlight, the shape outside the tent, the whisper that wasn't supposed to answer back. Real horror doesn't need monsters. Sometimes, it's just what waits in the quiet. If you made it to the end, you're one of us. Subscribe for more real sleepover horror stories. And remember, it's never just the wind outside your window.